Walk into any American history museum, and the colonial era looks dignified. Brass buttons, quill pens, oil portraits of men who look like they have never broken a sweat. The founding fathers stare out from gilded frames looking composed, scrubbed, and frankly, a bit majestic. But underneath those fine coats, colonial Americans were living in conditions that would make a modern sewer worker flinch. The powdered wigs were hiding scalps crawling with parasites. The fine linen had not been properly washed in weeks, and the streets outside those stately homes were open sewers in all but name. Today, we are peeling back the portrait varnish to find out how dirty colonial Americans really were. Brace yourself, because this one gets unpleasant fast. Colonial Americans had a complicated relationship with water, and not in a philosophical way. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the prevailing medical wisdom held that submerging the body in water was actively dangerous. Physicians trained in the humoral tradition believed that water, especially warm water, opened the pores and allowed disease to seep directly into the body. A full bath was not just unnecessary, it was considered borderline reckless. The result was predictable. Most colonists went weeks or even months without washing their entire bodies. A linen cloth dipped in cold water, quickly rubbed across the face and hands, was the closest thing to a daily wash that most people experienced. Full immersion was reserved for desperate medical situations, and even then, many physicians advised against it. Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister in Boston, wrote extensively about health and disease prevention, but never once recommended regular bathing as a remedy for anything. The logic was circular, but firmly held. Illness was everywhere. Water exposure seemed to precede illness. Therefore, water must be part of the problem. No one questioned the reasoning because the conclusion matched the lived experience of people who had no germ theory to explain what was actually happening. Even among the wealthier classes, who could afford heated water hauled in buckets to a large wooden tub, a proper bath was a rare event. Elizabeth Drinker, a Philadelphia Quaker, recorded in her diary in 1799 that she had just taken a shower bath for the first time in nearly 30 years. She was 65 years old, and she considered herself remarkably modern for trying it. The poor simply did without. There were no public bathhouses in colonial America. Rivers and creeks served in summer, but in winter the choice was between freezing water and no water at all. Most people chose no water. Seasonal variation mattered too. Whatever washing did happen tended to cluster in the warm months, when hauling and heating water was less of an ordeal. By February, after months of minimal contact with soap or water of any kind, the average colonial household smelled exactly like you would imagine. Dental care in colonial America was, to put it gently, a nightmare. Toothbrushes existed in some form, mostly imported from England, where they had been adapted from Chinese designs using boar bristles set into bone handles. But they were luxury items that most colonists never saw, let alone used. The standard approach to oral hygiene was rubbing the teeth with a rag, sometimes dipped in salt, or a paste of sage and charcoal. It worked about as well as that sounds. Sugar was becoming increasingly available throughout the 18th century thanks to Caribbean trade, and colonial Americans developed a ferocious sweet tooth. They stirred it into their tea, baked it into puddings, and packed it into preserves. Molasses, cheaper than refined sugar, was consumed by the barrel in poorer households. The problem was that their dental technology had not remotely kept pace with their sugar consumption. Cavities were rampant, and they only got worse with each generation. When a tooth finally rotted beyond tolerance, the options were grim. Professional dentists barely existed in the colonies. The local barber doubled as a tooth drawer, using iron forceps designed more for speed than comfort. Blacksmiths pulled teeth as a side service. Traveling tooth pullers moved from town to town with a leather bag of instruments and a reputation that preceded them, not always favorably. There was no anesthetic beyond a stiff pour of rum. The patient sat down, gripped whatever was available, and hoped the tooth came out whole. It often did not. Paul Revere, better known for his midnight ride, actually worked as a dental practitioner on the side, crafting replacement teeth from ivory and wire for wealthy Bostonians. George Washington himself is perhaps the most famous example of colonial dental disaster. By the time he was inaugurated as the first president, he had exactly one natural tooth remaining. His dentures, contrary to the popular myth, were not made of wood. They were constructed from hippopotamus ivory, human teeth purchased from enslaved people and the poor, cow teeth, and metal springs that pressed so painfully against his gums he could barely close his mouth. Every portrait of Washington with that tight-lipped expression, that is a man in constant dental agony. The colonial American toilet experience was, in a word, grim. Indoor plumbing did not exist. The options were an outdoor privy, a small wooden shack built over a pit in the ground, or a chamber pot kept under the bed for nighttime emergencies. Privies were dug as deep as the soil allowed and used until the pit filled up, at which point the whole structure was moved and a new hole started nearby. Wealthy households sometimes hired night soil men, workers who came after dark to shovel out the contents and haul them away in carts. It was among the lowest paid and most unpleasant jobs in colonial society, and the men who did it were social outcasts in many communities. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, where space was tighter, privy pits could not always be relocated when they filled. They overflowed. They leaked into neighboring wells. They produced a stench that, according to period accounts, could be detected from several houses away in warm weather. Archaeological excavations of colonial privy pits have turned up everything from broken pottery to animal bones to lost personal items, painting a vivid picture of daily life that the written record politely omits. Chamber pots posed their own challenge, specifically the challenge of disposal. The polite method was to carry the pot outside in the morning and empty it into the privy. The less polite method, which was disturbingly common in cities, was to dump the contents out the nearest window onto the street below. Pedestrians walked at genuine risk to their clothing and their dignity. Boston eventually passed laws against the practice, which tells you exactly how widespread it must have been before legislation was considered necessary. In rural areas, many colonists skipped the privy entirely. The woods, the barn, or the nearest ditch served the purpose. Sewage management as an organized system was a concept that barely existed. Benjamin Franklin, who spent decades trying to improve Philadelphia's civic infrastructure, pushed for better drainage and cleaner streets. But even his efforts barely dented the problem. The sheer volume of waste produced by a growing colonial population overwhelmed every attempt at containment. The ground was saturated, the wells were compromised, and the smell was simply part of daily life. If there was one thing that defined the colonial American relationship with water, it was distrust, and for very good reason. Clean drinking water was extraordinarily difficult to come by, and most colonists knew it even if they could not explain why. Wells were the primary source of drinking water in most settlements, but those wells were routinely contaminated. They were dug near privies because both needed to be close to the house for convenience, and nobody understood that what seeped into the ground at one spot could travel through the soil and emerge at another. The connection between sewage and drinking water would not be scientifically established until John Snow's cholera research in London in the 1850s, more than a century later. In the meantime, colonists drank water that had been quietly mixing with their neighbors' waste and wondered why entire households kept falling ill with stomach ailments that no one could properly diagnose. The practical solution, arrived at through generations of bitter experience, was to drink almost anything other than water. Beer was the beverage of choice for adults and children alike. A mild, low-alcohol brew called small beer was consumed at virtually every meal. It was considered safer than water, and it genuinely was, because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed pathogens that colonists had never heard of but instinctively avoided. Even children drank small beer with their porridge at breakfast. Cider was equally popular, particularly in New England, where apple orchards were planted within a year of settlement in most communities. John Adams reportedly drank a large tankard of hard cider every morning before breakfast for most of his adult life, and he lived to 90. Whether the cider helped his longevity or simply made the smell of his neighbors more tolerable is a matter of historical speculation. In the southern colonies, where apples grew less readily and the climate favored sugarcane, rum filled the gap. Imported from the Caribbean and later distilled locally from molasses, rum was consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern physician. By some contemporary estimates, the average colonial American adult consumed the equivalent of several gallons of pure alcohol per year. They were not all drinking recreationally. They were drinking because the alternative was water that might genuinely kill them. Tea grew popular in the 18th century, particularly among the middle and upper classes, but even that required boiling water first, which accidentally sterilized it. The great irony is that colonial Americans stumbled into basic public health through their drinking habits without understanding the science behind any of it. They noticed that people who drank beer got sick less often than people who drank from the well, and they adjusted accordingly. Survival instinct dressed up as social custom. The elaborate hairstyles and powdered wigs of the colonial era were not just fashion statements. In many cases, they were a practical response to a losing battle against lice. Head lice were universal in colonial America. Rich or poor, city or countryside, nearly everyone dealt with them at some point, and most people dealt with them constantly. The parasites thrived in a world where hair was washed infrequently, hats were worn daily, and shared beds were the norm rather than the exception. Entire families slept together in one bed, often with visitors or boarders as well, passing lice back and forth in an endless cycle that no amount of combing could break. Mothers spent hours each week picking nits from their children's scalps, a tedious ritual that gave the English language the word nitpicking, which has outlasted the practice by centuries. Wigs offered a partial solution for those who could afford them. Wealthy colonists shaved their natural hair short or completely off and wore wigs made from human hair, horsehair, or goat hair. The wig could be removed, sent to a wig maker for boiling and delousing, and returned while the wearer's shaved scalp got some relief. It was the 18th century equivalent of throwing out the mattress to deal with bedbugs. The wigs themselves, however, were far from clean. They were shaped with a pomade made from animal fat, usually bear grease or tallow, and then dusted with wheat flour or starch to achieve that signature white appearance. The fat attracted insects. The flour attracted rodents. A wig left sitting on its stand overnight might be hosting a small ecosystem by morning. Sleeping in a wig was uncomfortable but common, because removing it meant the stand became a target for whatever was crawling around the bedroom. Common folk who could not afford wigs fought lice with more direct and often more dangerous methods. Fine-toothed combs carved from bone or wood were standard household items, used daily without much effect. Some families tried herbal rinses of vinegar and rosemary, which smelled better than the alternative but killed very few lice. Others turned to mercury-laced ointments that did technically kill the parasites while slowly poisoning the person applying them. The cure, in many documented cases, was meaningfully worse than the infestation. Laundry in colonial America was a production on the scale of a minor industrial operation, which is precisely why it happened so rarely. The average household did a full wash roughly once a month, sometimes less. Some frontier families stretched the interval to 6 weeks or longer, depending on the season and the availability of water and firewood. In between washes, clothes simply accumulated stains, sweat, and whatever else colonial life deposited on them. The process, when it finally happened, was brutal. There were no washing machines, no manufactured detergents, no bleach, and no running water to speak of. Wash day began before dawn with hauling water from a well or stream, sometimes dozens of trips with heavy wooden buckets. That water was heated over an open fire in a massive iron kettle that could weigh over 100 pounds empty. The clothes were submerged along with lye soap, a caustic substance made by dripping water through wood ash and then boiling it down with rendered animal fat. The smell of lye cooking was sharp enough to sting the eyes and strong enough to clear a yard. Once soaked, the clothes were stirred with a wooden paddle, pounded on rocks or washboards, and wrung by hand until the water ran clearer. Stubborn stains received special treatment. Aged human urine, collected in dedicated barrels and left to ferment for days or weeks, was a standard stain remover used across the colonies and throughout Europe. The ammonia that developed naturally in old urine broke down grease and organic matter with surprising effectiveness. Laundresses kept these barrels on hand and used the contents without embarrassment or apology. That is not a myth or an exaggeration. Urine was a deliberate, widely accepted cleaning product. After washing came rinsing in cold water, wringing by hand again, and hanging everything to dry on fences, bushes, or lines strung between trees. In winter, wet clothing froze solid on the line and had to be brought inside stiff as boards to thaw near the fireplace. The entire process consumed a full day from dawn to dark and left the person doing it, almost always a woman or an enslaved person, physically wrecked by nightfall. Wealthy households employed laundresses or sent their washing out, but even then the process was identical, just performed by someone else's aching hands. Linen undergarments served as the colonial deodorant system. The prevailing theory was that linen fibers absorbed sweat and body oils, keeping the outer clothing relatively tolerable. Colonists changed their linen shirts and shifts more frequently than they cleaned their outer garments, which might go an entire season without any washing at all. A wool coat was expected to last years, and submerging it in hot water would shrink it beyond use. So it was brushed, aired, and spot cleaned when absolutely necessary. The result was a population walking around in outer clothes that carried weeks or months of accumulated odor, food stains, and the general grime of colonial life. The concept of smelling fresh simply did not exist. Everyone smelled. And because everyone smelled equally, nobody particularly complained about it. Colonial American cities were, by modern standards, open-air waste management disasters. Paved streets were rare outside of a few major thoroughfares in the largest ports. Most roads were packed dirt that turned to thick mud after rain and billowed into choking dust in dry spells. And layered on top of that mud or dust was everything the city's residents and their animals had deposited there. Horses, pigs, cattle, goats, and chickens roamed urban streets in enormous numbers. They were working animals, transportation, and future meals, and they produced waste proportional to their population. A single horse generates roughly 50 pounds of manure per day. Multiply that across a city like Philadelphia, which by the mid-18th century was the largest city in the colonies and home to thousands of working horses, and the arithmetic becomes deeply unpleasant. Pigs were a particular problem. Many colonial cities allowed residents to release their pigs into the streets, where the animals served as crude garbage disposal. The pigs ate household scraps, rotting food, dead rats, and anything else within reach. In return, they left droppings on every surface and occasionally charged at small children. New York was especially notorious for its free-roaming pig population, which numbered in the thousands well into the 18th century and prompted repeated, largely unsuccessful attempts at regulation. The pigs were technically illegal on major streets, but enforcement was spotty at best, and residents who depended on the animals for food resisted every effort to pen them in. Human waste compounded everything. Gutters running down the center of streets acted as open sewers, carrying a slow, visible stream of liquid waste toward the nearest river or harbor. Butchers dumped animal offal in the road after slaughter. Tanners discarded chemical runoff from their hides. Dyers released colored water that stained everything it touched. The combined smell of a colonial city in high summer was, according to travelers from the countryside, powerful enough to cause physical nausea in anyone not accustomed to it. Rain offered temporary relief, but also overflowed the gutters and spread waste across a wider area. After a heavy storm, walking through a colonial city meant wading through a thin soup of mud, horse manure, and diluted human sewage. Dignified, it was not. The colonial American kitchen was a place where food safety, as we understand it today, simply did not apply. There was no refrigeration, no food inspection system, no understanding of bacterial contamination, and remarkably little anxiety about any of it. Food was preserved through whatever methods were available, and those methods ranged from barely adequate to outright hazardous. Salting was the most common preservation technique for meat. Pork was packed in barrels of coarse salt, sometimes stored for months, until it became a gray, leathery substance that bore little resemblance to the animal it once was. Beef was dried into jerky, smoked over hardwood fires, or pickled in brine with whatever spices were on hand. None of these methods were foolproof. Meat that had not been salted thoroughly enough began to rot from the center outward, and the person eating it might not discover the problem until the first bite revealed a green interior and a smell that no amount of seasoning could disguise. Fly contamination was constant and simply accepted as a fact of kitchen life. Colonial windows had no screens. Meat hanging in the larder attracted flies by the hundreds, and those flies laid eggs that hatched into maggots within days. The presence of maggots in stored meat was so common that many colonists simply scraped them off and cooked the meat without a second thought. Others cut around the worst sections and served the rest. Throwing spoiled meat away was rarely an option when the nearest market might be a full day's travel and the next slaughter weeks away. Bread, the absolute staple of the colonial diet, carried its own particular dangers. Flour was ground in local mills powered by water or wind, and it routinely contained contaminants ranging from stone grit that wore down teeth to rodent droppings that nobody could filter out. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain and thrives in damp conditions, was a specific and terrifying threat. When consumed in contaminated bread, ergot produced convulsions, vivid and disturbing hallucinations, gangrene of the fingers and toes, and in severe cases, death. Some historians have suggested that the bizarre behavior attributed to witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 may have been triggered by ergot poisoning from contaminated rye flour, though the theory remains debated among scholars. Dairy was equally precarious. Milk was consumed raw and completely unpasteurized, drawn straight from the cow and served within hours. It soured rapidly in warm weather and could transmit tuberculosis, brucellosis, and a range of other diseases directly from the animal to the person drinking it. Butter and cheese fared somewhat better, since the churning and aging processes created conditions less friendly to certain pathogens. But even these went rancid in the summer heat and were eaten anyway. The kitchen itself offered no help. Food was prepared on wooden surfaces cleaned with cold water at best. The same cutting board used for raw meat at dawn was used for bread at supper, with nothing more than a quick wipe between uses. Cross-contamination was not a concept anyone had encountered. It was simply the way things worked, and the stomach ailments that followed were blamed on bad air, bad luck, or divine displeasure. In a world this dirty, disease was not an occasional visitor but a permanent resident that never left. Colonial Americans lived under the constant threat of epidemics that could hollow out a community in a matter of weeks. Smallpox was the great terror of colonial life. Arriving with the earliest European settlers, it tore through populations repeatedly across the 17th and 18th centuries. The virus spread through close contact, and colonial living conditions could not have been better designed for transmission. Families of 8 or 10 packed into small, poorly ventilated houses with shared bedding and no understanding of contagion until it was already too late. Entire towns shut down when an outbreak struck. Churches closed their doors. The dead were buried so quickly that proper funerals became a privilege reserved for the wealthy. Cotton Mather, the same Boston minister who wrote about health, became one of the earliest advocates for inoculation against smallpox in the 1720s, a practice so controversial that someone threw a firebomb through his window in protest. Dysentery, known at the time as the bloody flux, was another relentless companion of colonial life. Caused by contaminated water and food, it produced severe diarrhea, dangerous dehydration, and death, especially among infants and young children. The infant mortality rate in the colonies was staggering by any standard. In some communities, roughly 1 in 3 children did not survive to age 5. Parents routinely delayed naming their newborns until it became clear the child would live, a heartbreaking but practical defense against the grief of losing someone who already had a name and a place at the family table. Yellow fever struck the port cities hardest, arriving on ships from the Caribbean and spreading through mosquito bites that nobody at the time could identify as the cause. Philadelphia suffered a devastating outbreak in 1793 that killed roughly 1 in 10 of its residents and caused the entire federal government to flee the city for the countryside. President Washington relocated. The wealthy packed their carriages and followed. The poor stayed behind and died in numbers that overwhelmed the ability to bury them properly. Malaria haunted the southern colonies, where swampy lowlands bred the mosquitoes that carried it. Settlers called the illness the ague, or the seasoning, a grim term referring to the period of shaking fever that newcomers endured upon arrival. Surviving the first bout was considered a rite of passage into colonial life. Many never passed. When colonial Americans fell ill from any of the conditions described above, the medical care available to them was frequently worse than the disease itself. Colonial medicine operated on the theory of the 4 humors, a system inherited from ancient Greece that held the body in balance through blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The treatments that followed from this framework were as inventive as they were counterproductive. Bloodletting was the standard remedy for nearly everything: fever, headache, infection, fatigue, unexplained pain. The answer was to open a vein with a lancet and drain blood until the patient either improved or lost consciousness, whichever arrived first. George Washington's death in 1799 was almost certainly hastened by the physicians who drained roughly 5 pints of blood from him in a single day while treating a severe throat infection. They believed they were saving his life by restoring the balance of his humors. Modern medical consensus is that they shortened it considerably. Mercury was prescribed with alarming enthusiasm across the colonies. Known as calomel in its powdered form, it was administered for syphilis, chronic constipation, melancholy, and what doctors loosely termed bilious disorders. The side effects included excessive salivation so severe that patients drooled constantly, rapid tooth loss, kidney damage, and full-blown mercury poisoning. Patients quite literally salivated their way into worse health while believing they were being cured. Laudanum, a potent tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, served as the colonial answer to pain management. It was undeniably effective for pain. It also produced widespread dependence that nobody at the time recognized as a medical condition. Mothers gave drops of it to teething infants to quiet their crying, a practice so common it was openly recommended in household manuals. Adults consumed it for everything from persistent coughs to grief to ordinary sleeplessness. It was sold without restriction by every apothecary in the colonies as casually as we sell cough drops today. Surgery, when it was attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia, without antiseptic, and frequently without any formal medical training. Survival rates for major operations were dismally low, partly because the same instruments used on one patient were used on the next without cleaning, spreading infection from body to body in a chain that nobody could trace. Many patients, knowing the odds, simply refused treatment and preferred to take their chances with whatever was killing them. Given the alternatives on offer, it was genuinely hard to argue with the logic. So the next time you see a painting of colonial America with those stately brick homes and dignified gentlemen in powdered wigs, remember what the artist conveniently left out: the rotten teeth, the crawling scalps, the chamber pots sailing out of second-story windows, the streets layered with things better left unnamed. Colonial Americans built a nation, and they did it while smelling absolutely terrible. If you enjoyed this trip through the filthier side of American history, leave a comment and tell us which part you are most grateful not to have lived through. And if you have not already, subscribe for more from the past that the textbooks politely left out.